Dr. Patterson is Emerita Professor of New Testament at Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, where she taught for a number of years, and is the project director for the Communities of Calling Initiative of Collegeville Institute, and also the associate project director for the Call to Lives of Meaning and Purpose initiative. She is an Episcopal priest who for more than a decade collaborated with a colleague in ministry. They gathered people together for over a decade to reflect upon how to live faithfully amidst the challenges of daily life, and do so by the light of Scripture. And it was there that she developed a focus on vocational discernment as a basic Christian practice. Her PhD is from Southern Methodist University, and she's the author of Keeping the Feast, Metaphors of Sacrifice in 1 Corinthians and Philippians. She is a contributor as well to Calling All Years Good, Christian Vocation throughout life's season. We're blessed today to hear from her, this one who said yes to a calling, to study calling, and will share it for us now. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Patterson to the lectern or wherever she's going to stand?
Thank you so much. I am so glad to be with you all today. To talk about something I love and listen to other people talk about something that I love for an hour and a half, that's just great. So I'm really glad that we're all here together. I would love to do this as kind of a workshop. I know it's it's like a big space for us to be in, to feel workshop-y, but maybe we can have that metaphor for at least for how we are together. And just to start, I would love to hear a little bit from a few people who represent some of the different groups who are here and why you're interested in calling. I know we have some Called to Lives of Meaning and Purpose folks who are here, but maybe how to help congregations think about calling. Maybe that's not exactly why you're at this, but from some of you, you can just, yes, thanks.
Here from First Baptist Church Amarillo to talk about faith in the workplace.
Oh, from First Baptist Amarillo to talk about faith in the workplace. So the name of the ministry I used to serve, it became St. Benedict's Workshop for reasons of becoming a 501c3 and having to have a certain kind of name, right? But we were the Center for Faith in the Workplace before that, because we were really interested in just those daily life decisions, which really involve listening to how God is calling you and attending to how God is moving through you or not moving through you in all those daily life things. So I'm so glad you're here, and I hope you'll ask maybe some pointed questions or observations from what you're interested in. Someone else with a different, yes?
I'm here as a member from FBC Waco, and I'm a mom who has 4 kids now, so I'm kind of interested in an individual calling firm.
Oh yeah, very interesting. So,
And the church as well.
yes. So a variety of interests for this person. She has older children, so she's interested in kind of those young adult, how people like teens and young adults are beginning to think about callings. And also she is interested in congregational calling. It's such an important topic right now, I think, that brings so many people together, even from outside of church life. People want to know how to live a life that at the end of it, you don't feel like you missed it somehow. And I think often young adults, that becomes a source of pressure because they haven't had a million other experiences. They haven't really learned how it is that, your callings will come find you. They will come and find you, however hard you try to get away from them. But for them to be able to learn to listen to this beyond the self sense of calling, I think is a really important skill and is encouraging to them to feel that they're not all alone in trying to figure that out, that we'll talk about this. We're in a web of people evoking it from us. Yeah.
And also for myself, as maybe perhaps it's changing or evolving.
Yes, as your kids age, that right in itself suggests that there's other new seasons coming. So Yeah, I think, yeah, I'll talk about in a second vocation across the lifespan a little bit. Anything else that's really different? Yes.
This is a little bit different. My colleague and I work here at Baylor in an office called Major Exploration and Success Advising.
Major Exploration and Success Advising at Baylor.
We are tasked with working with undecided students who are in search of a good fit major, or students who are transitioning from one major to another because the first one was not a major.
Oh, so interesting. So they're helping people whose major isn't clear to them earlier on, or people who found one was a dead end or just not the thing. Which isn't that everyone in college almost? A few people have just a really clear sense, but many people are tacking back and forth. Yeah, thank you. You may wonder why I'm repeating everything. It's partly so that you all can hear it. It's also because there's a video and they won't hear anything I don't say. So it's interesting, but I kind of like that slow down, that chance to think things through. Anything else I should know? Yes.
Slightly different. I'm here with a group from Hope College.
Oh, yes.
And I'm director of a senior seminar program, a required class for all seniors to take before graduating, in which you explore worldview and vocational calling.
Oh,
Trying
wow.
to give them frameworks as they launch into the next chapter.
Wow. So this is someone who works at Hope College with seniors in a seminar in which vocation is a piece of what they're talking about, and I wish I had had that. Maybe people did offer that to me, and I didn't know I needed it at the time. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Graves, and I am a postdoctoral fellow here in the Education Leadership Department. And I just completed my PhD at the University of Arkansas, in which my dissertation was about the hidden role of religiosity in public education.
Oh.
And as a former teacher of 14 years in Chicago, I could see spirituality and faith all over public schools, but the perception of church and state, God cannot be here, is very prevalent in certain parts of the country. So my
Yes.
research is uncovering all the ways in which, not all the ways, but some of the ways in which faith shows up and is expressed and can possibly be measured in public
Public settings. So Marilyn is a postdoctoral fellow here at Baylor, and her work in her PhD was about how religiosity is present and shows up in public education among students, among teachers. I'm sure like it's in the whole fabric of the thing. And if we broadened it to spirituality, we would even come to more ways in which people can't avoid attending to the invisible other that is around us. But there are places where people are very, very leery of that, probably for good reason. But yeah, so many great conversations we could be having. Let's get started on this conversation. So I love the title of this conference. I love the called together part and the age of discord part. And you will see as I go forward, to me, calling is essentially communal. Even when I am discerning my calling, it was within a fabric of other people's callings and other people calling me, evoking, like pulling my calling out of me, the way you all are doing this morning. Like, I'm gonna walk out of here with so many new things because I heard your questions, because I know a little bit about where you're coming from. So you're evoking new vocations in me even while I'm standing here. And I think that base level understanding of the fabric of human life, that it's whole, we are whole together, is a really important way for us to be thinking now. And vocation is a good way for us to kind of put that on the table in front of us because it's very clear there. And then the age of discord, our contexts pull vocation out of us. We cannot avoid right now the fact that we are all being called within an age in which there's so many divisions. That, I hope, is going to evoke in Christians this desire to see things whole and to see what connects us. I think my hope is that there's an inrush of that sense of calling at the same time that things are, falling apart and disintegrating. But if we could begin to speak into the public space our understanding of how truly essentially connected we are. It also just seems to me like an important thing for American life to move from the individuality of generations who came before, and that probably made sense for them. That's not making sense for how we need to live now. So I love the title of this, and I think vocation is all over it. So I'm about to show you a big circular model that I came up with, and I just wanted you to know how it came to be, because it took place over a long period of time that I got dissatisfied with how I'd been thinking about vocation, and my students sort of pushed me and pulled me into a new place. So we talked a little bit about St. Benedict's workshop. I've listened to people talk about daily life events, multiple groups every day, for a decade. And you can't hear that without becoming aware that discerning vocation in small things and large things is the grist of everyday life, for Christians in particular. And for some of these people, those gatherings in which we shared our lives and listened to God through the scripture and through one another, like we heard the scriptures completely differently because we were bringing these daily life experiences and pulling it out. But also, we learned how to listen to how God is moving in our lives. And I think that was very powerful for me to, and I think this is the gift of vocation, to go from worship of God and spiritual practices that I engaged and encountering God in other people and nature and all this stuff, but to get a feeling for the ability to see how God is moving in life. And that I can actually have a sense of where this is going. Like that is really powerful. God is not completely mysterious to me anymore to the level that God was completely mysterious to me before I engaged that. And I hope I might be able to let you see some of that. A lot of that comes from being a Pauline scholar. I can't help it. It's like my go-to. But Paul, I think, is really talking about the movement of grace in the world, grace as a power of God for life. We'll talk more about that, but I think Paul has a very practical way of thinking about vocation. I worked in the Collegeville seminar on vocation across the lifespan, and what that really left with me was the sense that from birth to death, we are engaged in discerning callings. Hey, Kathleen. So Kathleen is like someone who totally changed my life in this regard. Like she invited me into really thinking about vocation as something I was expressly thinking about. But, we think of children as being, like how would they discern a calling? They're not speaking yet, right? An infant isn't speaking yet. But that infant is calling. That infant is making parents like every day, creating calling in these other people. The infant is also surely like developing senses that are going to become vocational. But I think when we see vocation whole, the people who are calling it from us are as active, if not more active than we are. We're often being acted upon. So the infant is calling out of those parents, remaking them, as anybody who's had kids knows. Like those sleepless nights are turning you into a different person. And then at the end of life, equally, we are not only experiencing a vocational challenge of ending life well. I think that is definitely a thing, and our desires to leave a blessing behind, as we see in the Hebrew scriptures. But also, those people who are around us are also being changed irrevocably by being witnesses to our dying. And that's hard for me to talk about because there are just so many pastoral situations of that have made me an utterly different person. So So that vocation across the lifespan, yes, there are some very critical periods, like teens, young adults, and then people approaching retirement are really, again, at a big shift. But I love to look at the beginning and end of life and see just how powerful that is. And then I'm a contemplative. I spend lots of time in quiet, and we tend to just see things whole. Like that just kind of goes with it. That's just life for me. So if people are always saying to me, what is vocation? And I have, until the last presentation before this one, you are the first people to whom I have been willing to give a definition because, yeah, it got pulled out of me because I finally realized that people really do need that, even though I want to say it's a process. I want to talk about the practices of vocation because I feel as though when I give you a definition, then you can argue with it. And then we're in a whole different place from when I invite you to do something with me. But, okay. So it's how we take our places as agents of God's mission to reconcile all things to God and to one another. I don't know how you all talk about the mission of God. This is very clear. I'm an Episcopalian. This is what it says in the Book of Common Prayer. Like, this is the purpose of churches, is to do this work. But I think most of us have this in common. It's very rooted in the New Testament. So then what is the mission of God? Can you see this at all? I mean, I can explain it. As long as you can see basically that I've got these curvy lines, one on top of the other. I love, yeah, you can see I just took something I drew on the board and I just turned it into a slide. Philippians 2, 5-11, the Christ hymn in Philippians, let this mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be clutched, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. And I think that isn't just something about Jesus, that tells us something about God. That God chooses this low place. Like there's this image in Philippians of Christ's descent, and then he's exalted and raised again. And God is everywhere and all of that. But I want to give us a foundation of God as a foundation, as the place where our roots are laid, that God comes beneath us. This always looks to me like arms holding someone. And as I think about what Paul has to say about grace, or the channeling of grace, I think it's just helpful to think about grace as something that's sort of coming up through us, as though we were a plant, coming up through us and out into the world through the things that we do. So that's why I've drawn this way. So the bottom swoopy line is God, and God, it is, while I've gotten on to some of God's ways by watching God move in people's lives, there's also just an unknowable part of God. So there's this transcendent dimension to God, but also an immanent part. Like God comes up into the world in knowable ways that people will say, I really felt the presence of Christ with us this morning. I really felt the presence of the Spirit. Those would be ways that I think Christians commonly talk about how they feel the presence of God, or maybe in something awe-inspiring. I think the thing is, as we think about faith in the workplace, how can we sense with particularity how God is present in the details of daily life, in the mundane, in the workplace relationships and all of that. And, Paul really, I think a gift of Paul is he sort of distinguishes, here's the presence of Christ, here's the presence of the Spirit, here's the presence of God beyond knowing. And yes, we have a Trinity that's all one. And yet, as you'll see, I feel that the Spirit has some very particular work to do with us, that Christ has some very particular work to do with us, that we can recognize that aspect of the life of God. So then, God comes under us, and then I have the church here. This could also be someone asked me, could this be other human gatherings? It could be, yes. God uses everything, as we know, distressingly. God uses absolutely everything, sometimes not us, somebody we don't think God should be using, whatever. But I've put the church here because I think it's important for us to think. And this way of thinking about the church, the next big line is the world. The church is in service to the world. Because God loves the world. That's really what this whole thing is about, is that God loves the whole creation, like every bit of it. So the church is called to be this intermediary group of folks who are called to see to it that the mission of God is kind of bubbling up into the world for the benefit of the world. And so from Kathleen Cahalan, I got this sense of how the church comes under the world. Ministers, both lay and ordained, people who are called, they are called to serve the discipleship of others. So they come under disciples. I was really trying to get away from this sense of an org chart with God up above, and then ordained people and lay ministers over the people. I actually had someone in church who showed me an org chart like that, and I was like, no, I gotta do something that undoes that. So ministers are in service to disciples who are in service to the world. So each of us chooses to come below in the way that Christ came below. And we are called to these places. We are called, whether we're disciples or ministers, we are called to these specific ways in which we are part of God's mission to reconcile and heal and bring the world into flourishing. And so I have these kind of stems coming up because I just wanted to show how grace from God is moving up through us all and into the world. I think I've said all this stuff. I just want to highlight that there's a general conversation about vocation that I think can really get people off track. And it makes us think that it's all about me, I got to figure this thing out, which is at least what I thought as a young adult. It's very idealized. Oh, God had this idea about me when I was conceived, and I have to find that. It's a secret. No one knows it. I, of all people, like especially, I don't know it. How will I find it? And then sometimes without thinking it, we have a sense that callings are constant, that it's not going to change, when in fact they're shifting and changing. Even if you stay in sort of what looks like one calling, it changes over time. It becomes very different based on your experiences, but also they end, like they arise and they end, and being able to discern those new arisings and those endings is a really important piece. I think we speak about it as though we'll know our calling because it will be so amazingly blissful. And the important ones, at least, have a big measure of suffering and responsibility, like two kinds of things, like the daily, the responsibility, gotta do this stuff, but also because if you're in deep relationships with people, there is always going to be suffering because human life is fragile. So there will be suffering. And then I think in the general talk about callings in the world, most people think it has to do with work. That's my calling. People say, that's my vocation. And then my avocation is actually this thing I love to do that I'm so passionate about, right? And I would say, like for many people, work is not deeply vocational. They're doing work to earn the money to support a life in which they can have these relationships that are important. They can show up for their community, for their family, and or maybe drawing or painting or whatever. But especially if we look globally, the people who can say that their work is vocational, or it's a very small number of people. We think in the US that that's a thing that people get to do, but people often don't get to do that. I'll do this part and then I'm going to stop for a second. So this is what happened to me in my class. Like a student was drawing this picture, and we'd been doing pictures like this. I'd been drawing. I myself had been drawing pictures like this. This is what vocation looks like. God calls me to do something for you. But I was getting really unhappy with it because really it's much more complicated because God is calling everybody around us, like that's pretty clear, but they are also calling us. They're pulling vocations out of us and honing our vocations. They're very active in terms of how they are functioning with us. And anytime, I mean, I know that all of you, because you've said a little bit about your contexts, you know how it is that your calling gets pulled out of you and changed and shaped by the people you're trying to reach. Like, I am forever shaped by the students I have taught. I'm totally different. And I have come to feel that how we answer calling in community with others like this is how God finishes out our creation. We know we're not all done when we're born, right? But these things, how we answer these callings, how we get affected by others, how much other people are pulling the us out of us, that's the fabric of vocation. So I knew I had to like draw all this somehow. I'm going to do that. So I end up drawing a circle, which I'm going to draw in a second. But let me just see if we're on the same page so far. Is there anything you either want to tell me or ask me? Am I being clear? I'm just, okay. I'm never sure. To me, like afterwards, I hope I said the things I wanted to say. Okay, so Paul's understanding of grace is that it is the power of God for life. I know we all have in our Christian traditions an understanding of grace as unmerited favor. I recognize that, and I want to challenge that a bit. Of course it's unmerited. Everything that comes to us from God, like the fact that we exist, is unmerited. I think what Paul wants to say is, this is a power for life that God is entrusting. Like God wants to move that through you and into the world. And he actually shows people how to track that. So this word charis, grace, and then charisma, it can also mean, it's a word that can imply a gift, but I think it's really helpful to see it as a gift on the move. It is not a gift you can hold. That's the whole point is, if you try to hold on to grace, like it's not great, it would just disappear, it would just evaporate. Grace is always moving through you for the mission of God. So I just put this little piece of 1 Corinthians here just to show kind of what's happening under the surface in the Greek, because where our translations will almost universally talk about spiritual gifts, it actually says spirit things, breath things, or spirit things. And I think what Paul has in mind is not that our gifts are a possession. I think the way we've taken this over into our lives is to talk about spiritual gifts as though you've had it since you were born, you've got it, anywhere you go, you've got it. And I would say it's a potential, it's a power. Like, you do know after a certain period of time that God can do certain things with you. Like, you get aware of that. Like, you can pretty much count on that. But also the Spirit's on the move, and there might be a day when you're flat, or a day when everybody in the room is flat or whatever, and it's just not happening. So I think attending to how it's moving is important. And so then he says there are varieties of grace things, but the same Spirit. So we all have these varieties of ways in which God can channel the Spirit through us into the world, or channel grace through us. And great, I think really grasping that grace, if you want to talk about forgiveness, you could talk about forgiveness, but grace is a power of God for life. And Paul is really interested in the ways in which people who have been baptized into Christ, who are now part of Christ's body, can bring life even where a situation looks like it is dead and gone. And I think that's very important for us right now. As we look at the situation, it is very hard. But to know that we are all called together to channel this power for life. And God will show up in all these different amazing ways. That's why the fabric is so important. We just do our piece. So we may not need to look at all the rest of that, but I just really I could have chosen multiple places in Paul to just show you that he's saying grace things. He's not saying gifts, and he's saying spirit things. Yes?
Yeah, the idea of common good is certainly there, but I think specifically edification of the church, to build up the church. That
Yes.
Not that he's not disinterested in those outside the church, but primarily in that rhetorical flow in Corinthians, it's about not
Yes.
elevating yourself, but edifying or building up the church. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. So when Paul is talking in 1 Corinthians, and he has a similar piece in Romans, he's really talking about building up the church, and what we do in church as things to help build up the power of this body. I mean, the church is, I think, also an intimate place where we can really see this, and we have common values so that we can really see how that grace is on the move through us. Thank you. Please interrupt me and raise your hand and say things. And so I was working all one summer in Wyoming, teaching in every Episcopal church in Wyoming for a month, which is very, very fun. And I had a chance to see these sluice gates, which really made me think about how grace works. That in Wyoming, they don't mostly get rainfall. What they have is snowmelt that they then have to steward basically all year really well for the crops. So that snowmelt is coming, slowly through the year, and farmers channel it into this field or that field. And as one of my students said, yes, here's this main channel and it's going to all these different farmers. To get it into your own field, you have to actually pull a hose over and make it go into this field or that of yours, which I think is very interesting. It takes a little effort. You've got to get the hose there, you've got to make decisions. And I just think this is a really beautiful image of the life-giving quality of grace. Oh, questions? Anything now? Okay, yeah.
Oftentimes when we talk about grace, it's in the context of sin, God's
Yes.
grace to forgive you, and I know you mentioned that, forgiveness, but how does that play in?
So the question is, often we talk about grace in regard to sin. And one of the interesting things to me is, in 1 Corinthians, Paul's got issues there, but sin is not the main thing he's talking about. And he chooses to talk about grace. Grace is very important to him there. Because I think he feels that people are misusing the power of God, and I think they are getting that idea. I'm just thinking about this in part as I'm answering your question, that people are thinking that they have a gift, and therefore I'm superior because I have the gift of tongues or I have the gift of whatever, right? Whereas most of us would, I think, feel that a gift of tongues, it happens when the Spirit decides to use you. That's not really a thing. It's not a gift that you can hold on to. You don't control it. You don't control the timing of it, all of that. And I think Paul is trying to help people see the importance of building up the whole by attending to how grace is at work among all of them. And he's really, he says repeatedly in 1 Corinthians that the people that you think are least sophisticated or, not really in the know, those people know how to love. So they know God better than anybody else here, if you know how to love others. And I think the thing is that love is such a powerful channel for grace, right? So Paul is really lifting that up. Does that answer your question? Or, I think in the history of theology, we have come to a place where we think of grace in regard to sin. And I think that's not the only thing that Paul has to say about grace. I wouldn't say that he never talks about that. but that's not across all of his letters. That wouldn't be the principal thing. He really talks about sin in Galatians and Romans, where he's working with, I think, issues of the Jewish part of the community, feeling that the Gentile part is so mired in the power of sin, like systemic sin, that they can't get it. Like, how could you just welcome them in here without having them become Jews? Like, they have to leave stuff behind more. And Paul is saying, hey, God's grace is on the move through these people. And so that's where that's where I hear it coming up in relation to sin. Like, that's grace, that God would accept these Gentiles in who they didn't deserve it. Thanks. So finally, this is what I finally came to in a classroom. Honestly, I just wanted an image of wholeness. I went up and I drew a big circle, and I didn't know what I was going to put in the circle. I just started then sticking into it all the stuff that I think makes up vocation. So you'll see right away, I've got Christ and God and the Spirit in different places, but that's just a reminder that like nothing in here is separate. God is not separate from the person in discernment, not separate from what I call channels of grace here, which really is like the instruments of your vocation, the virtues, the skills, but also the stuff. Like I use whiteboards a lot. Like that's an instrument of my vocation, or a channel. I hope it's a channel of grace. And then those people who evoke calling from you, they are in the fabric. We are all always in a single fabric of vocation, all of us together, as we are sometimes really naming someone else's vocation or pulling it out of them, or getting better at a skill or teaching someone else a skill. We're always all together, and all of God is always working with us in that. Does that make sense to you? Like, at least if you could suspend disbelief for the moment, just for the purposes of this, it's because I work with Paul, and Paul does talk really specifically about how Christ is on the move, how the Spirit's on the move, and how God is on the move. And so I can't distinguish those things without kind of doing this. So just a couple of things about this. The upper half, where I've got God and the person in discernment, there's a transcendence there. And I think there is a really profound transcendence to human beings. There's so much we really don't know about ourselves. I think that is why spiritual gifts inventories are very valued by people in congregations. And I've gotten to a place where I don't discourage people from using them, because anything that can help you know yourself better, the magic of those happens as you talk back to it. You go, yeah, I really see this, I don't see that. Maybe I'll find out whether or not that's, a channel God might use with me, a gift that I have. But I think just recognizing that unknowability, I think if somebody had told me that when I was a young adult, I don't know, maybe I would have said, oh, now it's like 10 times harder than I thought. But I already knew that myself was so hard to know. And I thought I should know myself better than I did, at 20 years of age. And so recognizing the mystery of us, I think, is important. And then the lower part, what's nice about vocation is there's actually some very visible parts of it. Like how people respond to you and how they either reflect back to you that a calling is vibrant, or reflect back to you that no, like they're not feeling it. Like they don't, you make pottery and no one wants to buy it. Or, so maybe you still like to make pottery, but you're not going to try to sell it anymore. I mean, there's just these ways in which, like, people's response is something that you can see. And channels of grace, I call it like visible. It's like me using a whiteboard, or name a profession, name work that people do. Like a cashier. They've got to know like multiple things, multiple machines. They've got to know how to work with people well. These are all things, the thing is we have some control there. we can actually, there's some stuff we can get better at. So I think in that Channels of Grace area, there's a part where we could get better at stuff. And that's, I think, encouraging. And we can see it. We can see ourselves get better. Questions or thoughts about that? Yeah.
I like your emphasis on community as co-callers with us.
Yes.
I think that used to happen more, at least in Baptist life, than it does now. George Truett didn't even want to go into ministry. The church says, yes, you are, and drags him down, and here we go. I think there was a day when the church kind of picked out folks they identified as gifted for ministry, and now I think when that young man or young woman comes up and say, well, can't you get in med school, or would you consider being a lawyer? So I think not only are we not calling them, I think we're dissuading them from entering ministry. And I know vocation is bigger than ordained ministry, but it really comes down, at least in the Baptist context, the student ministers are now the best ones to identify their students with the gifts. They end up sending them to seminary, and they all start out as student ministers, and then find, hey, there's another call.
There's a call.
Beyond that.
Yes.
But I think the community, we're giving them the role. I think Scripture gives them the role, but I think we're failing in that role because we just don't want to put people in the front lines.
Yes. He's talking about, can you all hear this? The role of community in calling and how significant that has been over time. And I think as communities are eroding in a certain way, people are loath to sort of enter into someone else's life. And maybe, you can, communities, sometimes they make themselves felt by discouraging callings. But if we had a sense of community in which we can be wrong, like we sometimes might think someone has, say, a calling to ordained ministry, and it turns out not really to be right for them, but we thought that would be great, but it doesn't work out for them. But if we had more of that permission to muck about a little bit as community, and to at least give back to people what we're seeing in them, like what the gifts that we do see in them. Because what we might see as a calling to ordained ministry, say, might turn into something else that requires many of those same qualities. It just is going to play itself out differently. So it's not terrible to not name the thing, not name the specific vocation, but if you can tell people what you see in them that is so full of grace, I think that's helpful.
So I think that goes back also to your comment about the gifts assessment, where we have a conversation.
Yes.
One of the challenges that I've seen, and I am in agreement, is that people are speaking into people's lives, but that was not God speaking through them. So people were going in different directions, and there are a lot of people leaving ministry because they found out once in it that really wasn't their calling. But if they had the opportunity to have a dialogue and then take time to reflect, I think that would help also. So I'm saying yes, I think that we need to hear from others, but we also need an opportunity to dialogue and to reflect, to determine what God is actually calling us, the direction God is giving us for that particular time of life. Because as you said, vocation, it has starts and stops.
Yes. So the importance of people getting to respond to what other people, whether it's to the gifts inventory or to other people who are there in that group who are saying, oh, I think I see your calling. And what you made me really hear is ultimately God is the caller. For someone to say, to take it upon themselves to say, God is calling you to X, whoa, you better really be sure of that, right? It's a really different place to say, I've noticed this and this and this about you, and I've begun to wonder if God might be calling you toward thus and so. But to learn how, that's what our hub in the Call to Lives of Meaning and Purpose initiative was trying to do as communities of calling, to become communities that can speak about calling and work with everyone in the congregation to have a common conversation about calling. Yeah. Yes.
This is just very invigorating for me.
Oh, good. I'm hoping that you're not time is passing, and I hope you're not squirming in your seats. Okay, all right.
I wanted
Yes.
A lot of what you're saying, that's what I'm kind
Oh,
of hearing in my
yes.
head, and it's getting me excited as you can tell.
Yes, yes, but yes. And I think, I mean, that's part of the good of what's coming out of this time, where a person like me, a white lady like me, has access to other ways of thought that come out of other communities. And I don't want to be like a vampire, like pulling life. I want to reflect it with grace and not act like that was mine or something. Does that make sense? So I kind of stick to my own voice and kind of how I came to some of this stuff. But yes, womanist thought, Howard Thurman, these, that rich understanding, particularly of how the community functions, like how we just are community, like that is what we are, has been deeply life-giving to me. Like it's a real source of grace. Thank you. I would love more conversation about that. Thank you. Yeah, I've got two people here. Yeah, work it out between you.
I love the idea of how we discern within community and how we're transformed, especially your image of motherhood. I also know that sometimes society can kind of exacerbate that role or have certain ideas of what your vocational calling should be. That they almost
yes.
work against what you feel inside of you, but your surroundings and your society, your community are not affirming that because there are certain ideas of who you need to be as a mother or even as a pastor.
Or what motherhood is. So the person is asking about, yes, when your society around you has different ideas about your calling or the nature, like, yeah, you're a mother, therefore you will be like this.
The extent of it, and I just wondered about that, the discernment of that and how that can really play out when there's something that testifies inside of you, but there's so much resistance within your community.
Yes. Well, I think it's really interesting to think about the sort of the prophetic edge of vocation, that I think if you have some trusted others that you can discern with, especially like, how shall I be a mother, say, then I hope that person would feel empowered then to live motherhood as they feel called to live motherhood. Like, this is what a mother looks like. Because I'm a mother, like this is it, especially when it's been discerned with others. I think that's really powerful, and I think maybe that's something for all of us to take on. And I'm still thinking about faith in the workplace, like that there is a prophetic edge to all of our vocations as we live Christ in them. Our society. I hate to be this dire, but there's a part of me that's a little bit dramatic. I want to say, like, we would hang Christ on the cross again, I'm afraid. The living of Christ day to day remains costly. It remains deeply prophetic and challenging to the world around us. And whether you're doing that as a mom or you're doing it as somebody working in a grocery store, you're doing it, this life that God has called us to is countercultural. It always is. So I thank you so much for just raising up that bedrock. Christ in Luke is so much a prophet. Like, we are called to that prophetic ministry all over the place, willy-nilly, like we don't know it. I just wanted to be a mom. Now here I am standing up for something in the school, or I'm trying to help this kid that I think is really going off the rails and nobody else cares, or whatever it is, right? Like, so thank you for your question. Did I respond appropriately? Did I hear you? Okay. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble here. I'm going to come closer.
So in certain places, cultural issues come into play. And no matter what you do to inspire young people, I work with young people in New York City. No matter what you do to inspire young people because of cultural issues that are happening at home, a lot of this may be difficult for the young people.
Oh, totally.
So how can you support those young people along their journey?
Yeah. What would you say? Yeah, what have you discovered in trying, I mean, I sense it, this is exactly what you're doing. You're trying to help people who have headwinds against them all the time have a sense of what they are called to, who they might be.
So what I say to them? So to follow their passion. So, they may not want to be a physician, but their parents are telling them they need to, that's what they want them to do, to follow their passion. So maybe they can still go into medicine or a lawyer, but also follow their passion on the side, so they're not depressed and are happy where they are in their lives and the impact that it may have in their community. So they can do both.
So what she's talking about is encouraging young people to find their passion, so that even if they do follow a path that their parents have marked out, because this will earn good money and respect and all those things, maybe you have to do that. For many reasons, you might need to do that. And if you have the abilities, your family may push you there. But not to lose track of the fact that your passion is here, and that you need to make space for that in your life. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask you, Ishmael, and then
what could be an intersection between maybe discernment and the voice of the people. We were asked in my church to look at an article why I left the church, which is a pastor in Arlington, who served for 10 or so years, and then immediately decided to exit as a result of issues going around in that church. So he was a pastor who I'm sure was convicted that ministry was his calling, and then realized at some point that he was not the right fit. Right? So how do you kind of describe what happened in those situations?
I mean, so every vocation story, there's a question about someone who had discerned a call to ordain ministry, and then stuff happens in the church, and the person goes, ooh, yeah. Like, this is really toxic. I assume this was a really toxic situation. The person goes, no, I am not called to that. And, I'm going to talk a little bit, well, I'll just go ahead and talk, because we got the whole vocation circle here. But when I talk about, like, the Christ part of it, like, Christ is in those places of, I'm just going to name it, like, of sacrificial offering. Like, sometimes a vocation is really deep and we feel called to make a sacrificial offering. Say, taking care of a child with many issues or many needs, like that a parent might decide, I'm putting my personal calling on hold and I'm going to take care of this. But there's a point at which you need to discern, like, who's the person in the situation with the most power? I think power dynamics are really important in vocation. And if you are the person with the most power, your job is usually to serve others. If you're not the person with the most power, your job is to, like, hold steady if you can, if you've got people around you to help you hold steady and try to get the power to shift. This person, I mean, it may be that person, like, the calling didn't go away, but it could not be realized in this life. There are also places in which the wrong thing happens. It does. Vocations get broken, terminated, made impossible for us to follow unjustly. Like, I would call that an occasion of injustice if the person he wanted to serve, but not in such a sick setting. So he will flourish. God will call him. Like, God is still calling him elsewhere, doing stuff with him. Like, that doesn't end. But I think recognizing that point of injustice is really important with calling. Like, God's justice, just because we have these ideals, like, this is ideal too, that what I've drawn is an ideal. But calling on the ground is very messy and heart-rending sometimes when someone cannot find that place of flourishing because the world is not responding. Thank you for bringing that up, because it's such an important thing about vocation. When we say it's not ideal, that's one thing to have it up in your head. It's another to be living the fact that the world is, it's fragile, it's broken, it's raggedy, and vocation doesn't always get fully realized here.
Can I also add that the
Yeah,
world
please.
and the church sometimes is not ready?
Yeah, the church is not pretty. I mean, that was what this story was about, was a church that could not steward well the calling of their pastor. Like they couldn't do the dance with the pastor.
Jane,
Yes.
we've been thinking a lot about confusion related to calling.
So this is about confusion relating to calling.
And early on, you said something that struck a chord with me, that individuality is not making sense anymore. And I'm wondering if that isn't, the individuality part of it isn't an important aspect of why we're confused, especially if we ought to be thinking more communally. So my question is, we find somebody that's struggling or confused, how do we move them from that individual perspective to that communal perspective?
Oh, when you see someone, an individual who's struggling a lot with vocation, and when they think it's like all up to them and they just have this like private distress, how can you move them to this communal view where there might be help, right?
How could I move myself?
How could you move yourself?
Yes.
Yeah, what do you think? What's your hunch about
I just
that?
think you're onto something.
You think I'm
Because I
onto
would see
something.
the calling as individual more than communal.
Yes, people do think of calling as individual rather than communal, like essentially communal. Yeah, the Call to Lives of Meaning and Purpose folks have all been working with congregations, you know, it's you have like trying to help them think in this more communal way. What have been, like, has that gotten through to people? Do you feel like the individual, it's not just individuality, it's individualism as a thing in the US. Like, has that remained an issue for you all?
It's a Western question.
It's a Western
Cultures in which
question,
you would
yes.
think
Yeah,
you
it's in the,
choose what you are.
Right.
Community would always tell you who you are.
Right.
But as me, myself, and I, as a Westerner, we think we are the locus of our own calling. We're the
yes.
community.
Yes. I think, you know, in some ways, what we're onto here is another aspect of the prophetic nature of what we're doing. It's really countercultural to think this way, to think communally. And we have to keep pushing on that. But you see, the fact is, you can tell by looking at the world that it really functions as a whole. Like you could just point to things that people have actually seen to help them see that, but we need to have it brought to our consciousness. Yeah, let's see. Again, we've got two of you, one right in front of the other. Which one wants to go first?
So, a lot of what we've talked about and a lot of what other people have shared is appropriately around following passion and gifting, right? And that's the buzz when we talk about vocation and calling. I'm wondering if you look across Scripture, and I'm overstating, generalizing perhaps, there's so many people in the story of the narrative of the Bible who were called to do something absolutely terrifying that they didn't necessarily think they were gifted for. And I'm wondering how much does that play into the conversations we're having with students in particular, but in communities? How do we recognize that when it happens? Because I found that in the stories that I've heard and in my own life, those are the moments of true transformation and a deepening of all of them. And it doesn't start with what I like necessarily.
Yes, yes. Calling doesn't always start with the things that we like. So the question is about, I think, really how to help people see, especially because the biblical stories so often involve people being handed a calling and going, no, I couldn't possibly do that. I clearly don't have the gifts. And God going, yeah, well, you're it, sorry, it's done. And, you know, there's a part of me that finds the overt call stories in the Bible very hard to relate to, partly because like there's the calling of the disciples. There they are, they're like engaged in this work that supports their whole family, like there's all that stuff. yeah, I'll come, sure, huh? And I just think there's probably a lot more behind that. But without challenging those, I like to look at other stories that are not about calling and see how calling is actually happening in these other stories. Because I think what those overt call stories are really about the power of God to call people. And so they're very, they really want to bowl you over with that fact. And that is an aspect of calling. But there's also, I think, this aspect down below, really attending to people's channels of grace and having a culture among your group, whether it's university or church or whatever, of naming what you see in people. That leaves it, they can work that out with God. They can have a deeper conversation with you or with someone they're close to. Like, if you give them that gift of where you see God moving through them, it might not be important to them. It might be something they don't want to follow, but I don't think you can go wrong by noticing those things and pointing them out. And so staying here, and then, the callers and beneficiaries, like pointing out, for instance, in a young person, like, I noticed all these other people your age, they really listen to you. Like, clearly, you're one of the people they turn to for advice or for leadership. Like, just remarking on the scene, I think, is really important. So, and God is in the scene. I think, there's a question here and then there.
So what happens when the community has this impression that a calling will lead to religious work?
Oh, yes.
And therefore, that community will not be helpful in guiding an engineer or a lawyer into something that God.
Yes. So what if the church community only thinks of callings as always being religious, always being to overt Christian ministry of some kind through the church? And so say a young person who feels called to engineering would have no one to bounce that calling off of. I mean, this is where I think we have this creative work in front of us of making churches places where, like, you can find, let's say you don't have an engineer in your congregation, but somebody knows somebody who's an engineer and can bring them in. Like, this could be the most creative thing that we are doing in churches, so life-giving, both for whoever, that engineer and for that young person who's asking the questions. Like, what could be more delightful than to get to talk about your work with a young person who's thinking about heading down that road? So nitty, like, and that's where the communal happens, like right in front of you, instead of it being, oh, I got to do this thing so I can counter individualism. Like, just as community starts to happen, that's, or does it? Yeah. I mean, all of this is, we're working against some tendencies in our culture, but we have the grace of God on our side. And I know that it is more powerful than all of this other stuff. If you're channeling it, it does make its way in very interesting ways. And there was a question, yeah.
I think you're starting to address my question, but I'm wondering if you might think, or have us think through with you, something that I see in my students, and that's just, rather than age of discord, it's an age of anxiety. They don't disagree on it.
Yes.
But that this is essentially a Christian, or at least a religious tax on what they're already doing with career discernment, and then we hand them this very well-fitting.
Yes. So I just wanted you to know what is at stake here. Like, God wants to call you to something, and they were terrified already, and with good reason. Oh yeah, I can totally solve that. Next question. Yeah, I just show them the chart, and then everything's fine. Like, here you are. Okay. No, I think that's a huge issue, and they are right to be anxious. It's a hard time, and I think we're seeing, like, the world of work in particular is really changing. The nature of jobs is changing. And some of us who did our discernment earlier in life, like the kinds of jobs that we have aren't existing anymore. And so what are we helping people discern for? But I think for churches to just be able to enter into a space of not knowing. I don't know, but I know some things about how God works. Here's a place you could start. And this, the thing with vocational discernment is you start off in what you think is a reasonable direction, just one step in that reasonable direction, and you will get tons of feedback from that. And then you can kind of figure out what the next step is. I think that's what I would encourage them to do. It really lowers the anxiety to know it's just about doing this thing. I'm going to take this course, or I'm going to go to this workshop. I'm going to start learning some things about this thing I think I might want to do before you've risked your whole life. And I think they do feel like, because people are always asking them, so what are you going to do after college? Like, they've got to have a fully fleshed out answer. And I think to learn to say, I'm going to do this thing, and that's going to help me know what my next step is. And the more we can share that with people, the better, I think. And God, that's what I mean by what I learned about the grace of God and learning how to see where life is flowing through someone. Paying attention to that really gives us direction. Like, God does respond as we take that step. There is a response. It shows up in our world as, we hope, like an enlivening in the person, a sense that they're affecting something for good around them. If you're just learning about something, it might be the internal sense of liveliness. But you'll start to see as you live into this thing that other people are coming to more life because you're doing this thing. So just experimentation, and we've said a million times in Call to Lives of Meaning and Purpose, like, there are no failures as long as you look back at the thing and like study it and see what happened, because you just learned something that you must make certain choices. Like, there's going to be a certain number of those that are going to give you negative feedback, which is hugely important to keep you from making the big commitment later on that would have been more costly. So, yeah, I don't know which of you was first.
So, in our project, it's been a lot about bridging older with younger in their vocation or calling. And it's been good for me, because I think whether I have a senior in high school, I have a freshman in high school, my husband and I both work with kids either voluntarily or for our jobs. And
So let me just say what you've said so far a little bit, so then I don't have to remember back too far. But it's a question about you're engaged in work that involves bridging across generations, and you yourself are a parent of two teens at different stages.
And so I think whether you're 18 or 45 or 70, this idea of who am I and what is my purpose?
Mm-hmm.
And who I thought I was and what my purpose was when I was 18, when my daughter is, to where I am now.
Yes.
It's very different. And I've gone from teaching at a Christian high school
Mm-hmm.
to working in a secular ministry. And it's very different. And so this group and what we've been working on has been so good for me, because it's been hard, the little things like, what are my pronouns? Well, I just work for a pharmaceutical company. I don't really want you to know my pronouns, So these small things, and what can I do? Can I be a light in the office with them? And I volunteered to be a mental health ally, because people in the company can call mental health allies. I want them to call me because I know the truth. I have God's word. I have a spirit living inside me. So these small things that we can do in the secular world. And every day I have to go back, because it's not like, all of a sudden I have it. You never have it.
Yes.
It gets challenged all the time. And then I have people like Bill and Gary who encourage me, and we have a Bridges meeting, and I'm like, I forgot my purpose this last week.
Yes.
And I needed this. And that's the Holy Spirit, and the grace reminded me what my source is, and it's not me. But it's an everyday dying self.
Yes, sorry, let me interrupt because I want to see if I can grasp this for them. So first she talked about how we really want to understand our purpose, and our purpose really changes over time. Like as we live into our calling, our sense of purpose shifts. But sometimes also, like she told another part of what she does in this Bridges program that she works with, where having a sense, at least at the moment, of what your purpose is can really be a guiding, like a measuring rod for whether you did this week the things that you intended to do. So kind of holding that sense of purpose lightly, understanding that it will shift, but for the moment it's a very important way to stay faithful to your calling. And it is hard, it is hard. And because she works with people from different generations, like they're having experiences that she doesn't, they're not experiences she has had, but she's like making these bridges to help others discover their purpose. And did you?
I was going to say, historically, one of the places that Baptists have gotten right is the mission field. So we can't get a church planter into this third world country. We can get a physician in there, we can get an engineer in there, we can get a business guy in there.
Yes.
And so we've allowed the missionaries to see their vocation, first of all, as a follower of Jesus, and they use their medicine or their business acumen as a tool. And yet somehow when we get over on this side of the pond, we can't see that engineers could have that kind of.
Oh yeah, that's so interesting.
So I've never had this thought till I sat and listened to you, but the reality is vocation is wide enough. We've done it on the mission field. We know how to do it.
Yes.
We just got to get our congregations to see I'm an engineer second, I'm a disciple of Jesus first, and whether it's Lockheed Martin or it's somewhere in the third world country, I have to see getting people the gospel is my primary goal, and the other thing is just a way to get the bread.
Yeah, so people see you could serve overseas as an engineer, and people would, as a missionary engineer, and people go, oh yeah, that's a calling. But if that same person does that work in the U.S., churches won't recognize that. Yeah, so sort of having that sense of missionary calling in the everyday. I want to just, so if you want this, I should have like maybe a sign up when I'm done. If you want this PowerPoint, I could send it to you. I also have it as just like a handout, which is easy. But I just want to skip ahead to some of these. Yeah, so I have things that you could think about, but you've asked great questions, so we don't need to do that. But I do, before we quit, I want to talk about Sabbath as a vocational practice, which is something that Claire and BU, like that, their team at Boston University has really thought deeply about this. And I think, we've talked about several ways in which the church conceives of vocation as very differently than the culture around us. And a really important way, I think, is the importance of all the things that happen in Sabbath keeping. So it's a space of rest. It's also a space of stepping back and letting God keep the world going. So my own sense of, and I have a very ragged Sabbath practice, but part of what has been so life-giving to me is realizing I don't hold the world. The world does not need Jane Patterson to function. Amazing, but true. And that when I step back and do not work, it all keeps functioning. And that, because I really experimented with really keeping a Jewish style Sabbath, really, like 24 hours of really not doing anything productive, not cooking meals, not doing anything. And that's not how I would keep it all the time. But the times I have, like, not painting a painting, not writing a poem, not doing anything creative, not gardening, in a more ordinary Sabbath practice, I do that stuff. But when I was trying to really find out what's going on with Sabbath keeping, that total stepping back from creating anything and letting God handle the creating of everything that's going on in the world was life-changing for me. I really understood then more my proper role in things. But I think as a biblical scholar, I know that the history of Israel was such they were almost never under home rule. They were always having to explain to other people whose work they were doing why they had to take a day off. And so I think like we too can say that we need a day off. It has always been countercultural. People who are the taskmasters never like it, never have liked it, have not wanted God's people to do that. And God's people have said over generations, this is what we do. This is part of our identity in who we are. And that stepping back and realizing we're called, it's a space in which we're called to be, not to do, and is so important as an aspect of our callings. I think it's a place from which calling can spring, like to realize that the stepping back from these heavy-duty callings for a bit is actually going to fuel the calling. It's really, it's a fuel for human life. It's a fuel for all the ways we listen to God. It's a really, really, really bedrock Christian practice. Thoughts about that? It also has to do with justice. And I think it awakens us to the ways in which other people in our culture don't get to rest. And that is a terrible thing. I really think, another space in which churches could speak that would be powerful is in standing up for people to be paid enough so it doesn't take 2 or 3 jobs, and they don't have to work round the clock, never get to be with their children, who are their primary vocation for many of them. Like, what's wrong that we don't make rest a big piece of our understanding of justice? Rest for everyone. I'm not talking about just us. I'm talking about for everyone. Let's just, anything else you want to talk about? Yes.
Addressing our calls and the community and saying when we're wrong, and we want the person to be the doctor, or we want the person to be the lawyer, because we've seen certain gifts of being able to say when, you have a host of things that any of us could do, and I'm just trying to help. I'm trying to be a voice for that. And the other thing
let me respond to that, because also I think you're really raising something that I haven't said at all that's a really important sort of theological thing. God has a million things each of us could do. That's the problem. Like, it's abundance. It's not finding like the one thing. God has a one thing. God has, like, you could do 50 other things. And especially those of us who are ordained, people think that I would say, oh yes, like I've been a priest forever. God made me a priest. I've always known that. No, if I had kept living in Massachusetts instead of moving to Texas, I was going to work on politics and education, because I was really interested in, for one thing, helping teachers understand the political things that affect their lives. So I would have done that. That would have been a full-on vocation for me. But I came to Texas, and none of the stuff that I had been doing could I do here, and I felt like I had a voice in the church. Like, so other things happened, and now I am who I am. I got made by my calling, but I think you're raising that up. Like the humility when we tell someone else, I see these skills in you. I wonder if maybe you have such and such kind of calling. Like to be humble ourselves, because we know God has so many things that person could do, right? And their context will pull it out of them. So anyway, so that was a long-winded response. And what was the second thing?
The second was when we were talking about the pressures on people. Now, I think you said the headwinds.
The headwinds.
That are on people. That one of the things that I think as church communities, and I'm often looking at it as a homiletician and from the preaching standpoint, right, of speaking to not only the passion in the individual,
but to the community. You know, do we have the groups of parents of the high schoolers or the college students who are like, yeah, they really want to be an artist, but I'm trying to get them to do, because I want them to have.
Yes.
But we can help be that voice to say, okay, and have you discussed X with them? And
yes.
what about when you were thinking about, I think Audrey's going to talk some in her presentation, what about when you wanted to do X? Right, to bring those kind of memories.
Yes.
I think a loving community, a supportive community can be that place to say, yeah, but we can have the conversation with the realization
yes.
that it might bring suffering. It might not make them make all this kind of money. It might not
right.
do the things that we're hoping for them to do.
Yes.
But that could be another part of how we talk about calling and helping people help others.
Yes. I wish I could, I wish I don't have a working mic that I could have given to you because I would like this to be in your own words. But LaRonda was talking about church communities as really being spaces of grace in which we can tell people what we see in them, hold it lightly. They may make other choices. Like there's just this rich, like you described, a very rich engagement of mutual knowing, mutual encouragement, humility, as a grounding for we're really helping people of all ages discern their vocations. And I think even when you focus on the young adults, all the older adults who are engaged with them have their own vocations tweaked with because they're having these conversations, right? Did I grasp like the core of what you were saying?
Right, that bringing to light that it is okay. And when I talk about the womanist thought, one
yes.
of the things I've been really trying to work on is that notion of bringing to light and acknowledging the things that we have missed, the things that our ancestors have missed,
yes.
that are deep